Once everybody is seated, we're going to begin the dinner. So we kindly ask that you take your seats. Thank you.
My first affair, so please be kind. Handle my heart with care, oh please be kind. This is all so grand, my dreams are on parade. If you just understand, they'll never, never fade. So tell me your love sincere. I needn't fear, oh please be kind. For if you leave me, dear, I know my heart will lose its mind. If you love me, please be
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are now going to begin the dinner for the GGGI International Conference 2014. During dinner, we have two distinguished speakers. I would now like to invite the first speaker to the stage. On behalf of His Excellency, Mr. Yoon Byung-se, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea, the Ambassador of Climate Change, Mr. Choi Jae-chul, will deliver his congratulatory remarks. Please join me in welcoming the Ambassador to the stage with a warm round of applause.
Good evening. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome all of you to this dinner. After a full and tight schedule of conference sessions, you now deserve a time of relaxation and wonderful dinner. I was informed that today's conference was very lively and successful in terms of content and the level of participation. This was made possible because all participants from all over the world have been actively and sincerely engaged in today's discussion. Once again, I wish to express my deep gratitude to all of you. My thanks also go to the GGGI Director General and his staff for convening this conference in a timely manner. It is very timely and opportune because we have very important events to be followed soon. The GCF pledging session is being held in Berlin on 19 to 20 November. It means today and tomorrow. And the 20th Conference of Parties of UNFCCC is scheduled in Lima from 1st and 12th December. There is a common goal and vision shared by all. That is to transform our carbon-addicted world to a low-carbon and climate-resilient world. This transformation can be made only when the world community works together based on global partnership. The Korean government launched a development strategy in 2009, which is known as a low-carbon green growth. This strategy has been further evolved to promote the innovation and the technology. The newly named creative economy addresses climate change response not as a burden, but as an opportunity, the opportunity to create new jobs and industries. fully utilizing the innovation and technology. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe the GGGI does indeed have a great potential. My trust in GGGI comes from the fact that the Council of the GGGI yesterday adopted a new strategy which focuses more on partnership and cooperation with the developing countries and with the private sector, which Korean government strongly support. The GGGI should strengthen its capacity and capability for assisting developing countries access to financial mechanism, in particular to the GCF, Green Carbon Fund. The GCF will be full operation soon after its successful initial capitalization. I firmly believe the GGGI is ready to engage developing countries in developing bankable projects, actually emphasized by Ivo Dubo, by providing necessary technical service. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to bring my remarks to a close here. Dr. Rajendra Pachauri, the chairperson of the IPCC, is waiting to deliver his keynote speech. I am sure his speech is the more enlightening food for thought for all of us here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Che. That was Mr. Che Jae-chul, the Ambassador of Climate Change to the Republic of Korea. And as the ambassador mentioned, we have a very distinguished and special guest waiting for his keynote speech. I don't think he is a man who needs any introduction. As you know, the IPCC synthesis report was recently launched in Copenhagen, Denmark at the end of October. And tonight you will be able to learn all about this report personally from the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rajendra Pachauri to the stage with a warm round of applause.
Thank you. Your Excellency, Mr. Jae-chul Choi, former President of Ireland, my good friend, Madame Mary Robinson, former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission in India, another very good friend, Monte Carlo Valia, and a bigger friend is my good friend, Ivo de Boer. I'm really delighted to be given this opportunity, but I do want to mention that this dinner is starting with something very unappetizing, something that's lying on your seats, and there's worse to come because I'm going to talk about it. So that's going to be even less wholesome than what you're going to eat in this very nice evening. I just want to tell you that this synthesis report is the effort of several years of work by a large number of scientists. It is based essentially on the 3 working group reports, and all 3 of them add up to about 5,000 pages of published material. And we also referred to 2 special reports that were brought out by the IPCC in 2011, one dealing with renewable energy sources and climate change mitigation, and the other on extreme events and disasters. Both of these, I think, were extremely important reports because clearly the first one brought into focus the viability, the attractiveness of renewable energy sources, even with technologies as they exist today, in a wide range of applications. And the second, in my view, made an enormous difference in telling the world that climate change is not just a smooth and steady increase in temperatures, and the term global warming is often mistaken to represent what one regards as comprehensive changes in the climate, but that you would also have disruptions in the form of extreme events. And these 3 working group reports were essentially authored by over 800 scientists from all over the world. And may I say they were selected from out of about 3,500 scientists whose nominations with CVs were sent by governments, international organizations, and so on. And it's a very elaborate process because we need to see that each of the authors fits into the outline of the report, which in itself is the result of a very rigorous exercise involving 200 odd people who sit 3 or 4 days to define what the new report should contain. And then this is approved by the panel. That means 195 governments which are members of the IPCC. And I'll just take a minute or two to tell you about the process by which a report is produced. We have several drafting stages, and in each stage, the draft is reviewed by expert reviewers. And finally, the draft is commented on by governments. Now, when that happens, we get a whole lot of comments, and these are acted on, and then a final draft is submitted to the government. In the case of the summary for policymakers, as you have over here, word by word. And I can tell you that's not a very pleasant exercise, but it's an exercise which, in a sense, brings the best of science and gets the ownership of the governments. And that, to my mind, is a unique feature of the IPCC. The very fact that it's an intergovernmental process ensures that, in the end, the report, once it is approved word by word by all the governments of the world, clearly has the stamp of ownership of all the governments. Now, in the process of the comments that we get at various stages of reviewing, each single comment has to be taken into account. And in a sense, you have someone like a monitor, he's called the review editor, who ensures that every comment is taken care of. And guess how many comments were received in the process of the 5th assessment report? Close to 200,000 comments. And each one has to be looked at very carefully by the authors, and they have to record. If they accept a comment, they say accepted. And if they don't accept it, then they have to attribute reasons why they don't accept it. I also want to mention the fact that quite apart from the 800 authors who actually do the writing of the report, there are literally thousands who are involved in the form of what is known as contributing authors. And what does a contributing author do? Well, for instance, if someone is a specialist on ocean acidification, he submits a write-up on what is happening to the oceans in terms of acidification and how this is going to impact on marine ecosystems, marine life, and so on. So, you know, he's a specialist with a very specific role to perform, and he submits a write-up which the authors take into account. And just to give you another number, the IPCC does not carry out research itself. The manner in which we function is to carry out an assessment of published literature. And on that basis, we come up with an assessment of what climate change is all about in all aspects. And you would be perhaps surprised to learn that the number of citations that we have in various parts of the 5th assessment report is about 30,000 publications. So, you know, that's the volume of effort that goes into this. And then finally, you get this dish which is on your chairs and tables, which is the synthesis of everything in these big fat bricks, as we refer to them. And this, of course, is a very interesting exercise, to say the least. Let me tell you and give you some of the major findings of this particular report. Firstly, let me emphasize that climate change is an integral part of what you might define as green growth. Because with a changing climate, it's possible that you would get much lower levels of growth, or for that matter, in some parts of the world, no growth at all. Because it would, particularly where you're dealing with people who are living in dire poverty, if climate change impacts are going to be prominent in their lives, they would find it very difficult to develop. However, it's also true that all the actions that are required to deal with climate change are an essential part of what promotes green growth. So these are the 3 working group Subjects over here, the physical science basis in the case of Working Group 1, impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability in the case of Working Group 2, and mitigation of climate change in Working Group 3. So these are the underlying sort of assessments that are carried out. And the synthesis report itself is written by a selection of the authors who write the 3 working group reports. So we had about 60 authors working on the synthesis report, and this is done under the supervision of the chair of the IPCC. And member governments approved the SPM on the 1st of November, and I can tell you this was the result of 3 nights of sittings, which is a very interesting process. And I have to chair the session, and everything is projected on the screen word by word, and it's discussed and debated. Now here, let me point out one very important aspect of this process. Governments often help enormously in refining the language, because to be quite honest, the underlying reports are written in very scientific language. And therefore, when you pick up material and synthesize it, there is always the tendency to say something that perhaps a non-specialist will not understand. So governments often will say, okay, you've said this over here, they tell the authors, I understand it, but you know, when I put it in front of my minister, he won't understand it, so why don't you write it in so-and-so way? And you know, if it's a good suggestion that actually improves the communicability of the message that's there, then you say, yeah, that's fine. So you change the language and it's accepted, without, of course, distorting the scientific content. And I'm proud to say that in the approval session of the synthesis report this time, and Dr. Hyo-Sung Lee, who's a vice chair of the IPCC, a very distinguished colleague, would perhaps bear me out, we were able to keep intact all the essence, all the substance of what we had proposed for approval by the government. So there was no dilution of the contents whatsoever, but significantly an improvement in the language of what was put across finally in the approved version. Okay, now I'd like to mention the fact that climate change represents essentially what Garrett Hardin referred to as the tragedy of the commons. Because the air, the atmosphere that we have on this planet is something that essentially represents the global commons. We all derive enormous benefits from it, live on account of it, but we're not responsible for ensuring its quality. So therefore, what has happened over a period of time, through industrialization, through deforestation, and a whole range of other human activities, we have changed the very composition of the atmosphere. So, basically, this is what one might call the tragedy of the commons. And therefore, what is really needed now in order to deal with this problem is a collective action problem. How do we ensure that human beings look at what we have done to the atmosphere of this planet, and how do we bring about a change so that the climate can be stabilized? What we have said very clearly in this report is that human influence on the climate system is very clear. The more we disrupt our climate, the more we risk severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts. The good news is that we have the means to limit climate change and build a more prosperous and sustainable future. And if we were to use some of these means, then clearly, within a reasonable period of time, we have a high probability of being able to arrest the changes in the climate that are taking place. Now, what we said is it is extremely likely that we are the dominant cause of warming since the mid-20th century. And when we use the term extremely likely, we are assigning a probability of 95%. This, incidentally, is up from 90%, which is what we said in the previous assessment report. Now, what you see over here is, of course, there are changes in temperature that occur as a result of a whole range of natural and other factors. But you see temperature increase taking off, particularly since the middle of the last century. The rate of increase is visibly much higher. Sorry, I think I'll just pick up a glass of water. Thank you, Eva. Thanks a lot. You're very kind. So this promises success in green growth when I have the head of this remarkable institution offering me a glass of water. Thank you very much. What you see over here is very significant. Each of the last 3 decades has been warmer successively than the previous one. And we know that it has been successfully warmer than the preceding decade since 1850. So if anyone says that warming is over, nothing is happening, the evidence is very clear, and this is based on observations. This is not based on any theoretical assumptions whatsoever. Another very interesting fact that we've come up with in the 5th assessment report is much more information on what's happening to the oceans. More than 90% of the energy accumulating in the climate system between 71 and 2010 has accumulated in the ocean. So you can just imagine what this might do to marine ecosystems and to marine life in general. And this warming has gone down to a depth of about 700 meters, and of course it's sinking lower. And frankly, this is an area where we don't have enough research to tell us what the implications of this will be over a period of time. And land temperatures remain at historic highs while ocean temperatures continue to climb. You can see that over here. This is the energy accumulation within the Earth's climate system, and you see the amount that has gone into the oceans. Another significant feature of what we've been doing in recent decades is the fact that greenhouse gas emissions growth between 2000 and 2010 has been larger than in the previous 3 decades. Previously, if you look at the trend, it amounted to about 1.3% per year. But since 2000, the rate has gone up to about 2.2% per year. So clearly, this is something that reflects not with a lot of glory on human society. We've had a UN Framework Convention on Climate Change since 1992. But what we're doing clearly indicates that we haven't taken it seriously. We haven't really implemented it to bring about a reversal of all the drivers that are leading to climate change. Where do all these emissions come from? Well, 35% from the energy sector, 24% from agriculture, forests and other land uses, 21% from industry, 14% from transport, and 6.4% from the building sector. So clearly, if we were to focus on the 2 major sectors that are responsible for these emissions, the energy sector is by far the most important, and also agriculture, forestry, and land use. This is something that we've highlighted specifically in this report. This gives you globally average combined land and ocean surface temperature, and this is essentially what I showed you earlier. But what I'm projecting now is part of an integrated diagram. And I don't mind mentioning the fact that this took quite an effort to get through for approval. Because when you look at all these 3 portions of the diagram, as I'll show in a minute, it gives you a visual indication that clearly emissions of carbon dioxide are an important factor in bringing about change. So if you look at globally average sea level rise, Well, since the beginning of the last century and up to 2010, the increase has been about 19 centimeters on average. This may not seem like a lot, but on the other hand, there are parts of the world that are barely a meter or 2 meters above sea level, and for them, the threat of storm surges, coastal flooding becomes that much more serious with the sea level rise that we've had. And I'll give you projections for the future, which give us another reason for concern as far as the future is concerned. Now, this gives you globally average greenhouse gas concentrations, and you would see that the green line, which should not in any way be associated with green growth, because that's carbon dioxide. So it's the very antithesis of green growth. But you have carbon dioxide, you have methane, and you have nitrous oxide. And clearly, the fastest increase is with respect to carbon dioxide. Now, this gives you CO2 emissions. And the dark portion over here is fossil fuels, cement, and flaring. And the yellow portion is forestry and other land use. Now, fortunately, in the case of forestry, there has been a slight decline in deforestation. But clearly, this is something that you really cannot rely on as far as continuing in the future. What's very significant is the increase on account of fossil fuels, cement, and flaring. And this is something that there were some didn't want to display. Now, you see all these together, they give you a kind of a picture, which I think is important, because at least visually you get some sense of the association between each of these trends taken together. Now, some of the changes in extreme weather and climate events observed since about 1950 have been linked to human influence. Two types of extreme events that I want to highlight are heat waves and extreme precipitation events. And in the special report that we brought out on extreme events, we said very clearly that there are some parts of the world where there is evidence to show that even if there's going to be there is a decline in average precipitation, the bulk of it is taking place in the form of heavy precipitation. So this, I think, is a very serious conclusion, simply because that not only has a lot of risk for life and property, but it also has major implications for the ability to collect water that comes as a result of precipitation for the benefit of human society. And the impacts are already underway, and I, some months ago, made a statement that there's no part of the earth that is untouched by the impacts of climate change, because it's taking place from the tropics to the poles, on all the continents and the ocean, and it affects rich and poor countries both. And here, I don't want to suggest that Hurricane Katrina, or for that matter, Superstorm Sandy, were the result of human-induced climate change. But they affected perhaps the most prosperous country on earth. And it really left in its wake a field of devastation all around, and major economic implications that you really cannot ignore. So it affects rich and poor. Of course, it's true that the poorest of the poor are most vulnerable, because they really don't have the means by which they can even come up with a minimal level of protection for themselves and the sort of meager property, the homes, the habitat that they live in, and so on. Now, what I'd like to mention is that continued emissions of greenhouse gases will cause further warming and changes in the climate system. Oceans will continue to warm during the 21st century, and it's very likely that Arctic sea ice cover will continue to shrink and thin as global mean surface temperature rises. Global mean sea level will continue to rise during the 21st century, and global glacier volume will continue to decrease. In the case of sea level rise, We have actually assessed 4 different scenarios in this report. And the one scenario where you really don't have any additional mitigation actions gives you the highest emissions and therefore the highest concentration of greenhouse gases. What does that imply in terms of sea level rise? Well, you could get sea level rise by the end of the century as high as 0.98 meters. So that's almost a meter. And that clearly is very bad news for a large number of low-lying areas across the globe, certainly for the small island states. I recall that in 1997, when I was elected as vice chair of the IPCC, the plenary session was held in the Maldives Islands, and the then president, President Gayoom, addressed us, and he says, ladies and gentlemen, the place where you're holding your meeting today, 7 years ago, was under 1.5 feet of water. So I think we need to look at the risks associated with sea level rise, which is not only in the form of the possible submergence of land areas, but several extreme events that are really going to knock out the ability of some communities to pursue any form of development at all, green, brown, or dark, whatever. So I think that's an extremely important issue that we need to take into account. The kinds of risks that the impacts of climate change will impose on societies across the globe will really knock out the ability of those societies to be able to grow in any way whatsoever. And here, let me also say that the Arctic is warming at a much more rapid rate than the rest of the globe. And we projected that if we go along with this no additional mitigation scenario, then by the middle of the century, in September, you will likely see no Arctic sea ice at all. So you could have an Arctic in the month of September that has no sea ice whatsoever. You will have ice on land surfaces, but not on the sea. And that clearly is not something that's going to confine its impacts only to the Arctic region. It will have major implications for the climate of the globe as a whole. Because when all that ice melts, it also affects the salinity gradient of the ocean. It affects ocean circulation and currents. So all of that has important implications across the globe. What does this translate into? Food and water shortages, increased poverty, increased displacement of people, and coastal flooding. Another area that we need to be concerned about is the impacts on agriculture. And this has important implications for food security because we already have a planet which is going to be inhabited by a much larger number of people than we have today. Who knows where it will stabilize, 9 billion, 10 billion. But we have looked at the impacts, again, on the basis of no additional mitigation scenario. And you find the blue lines are the positive impacts on agriculture because you have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that leads to greater photosynthesis and therefore you get an increase in yields. The brown and yellow bars give you the negative impacts on yields. And these, of course, as you can see, overwhelm whatever benefits you might get in terms of agricultural yields increasing. So by the end of the century, what we have is a fairly serious specter of what would constitute a major threat to food security across the globe. And here, let me also go down from the macro to the micro level. A large number of farmers, particularly in the developing world, are really not producing enough food to sell into the market. A large part of it is either used for their own consumption or at the most a little bit of barter among that community itself. And they are the ones who are going to be the worst affected as a result. So this is something that obviously human society would not like to encounter as we deal with the problem of climate change. Now, this gives you scenarios that show stabilization of atmospheric concentrations. which clearly requires moving away from the baseline, regardless of the mitigation goal. So whether we want to stabilize at 2 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees Celsius, clearly we don't have an option of not moving away from the baseline scenario. And what you find is the lowermost line over here is the one that has the highest chance of giving you temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius. And this particular scenario essentially means that by the end of the century, we should have zero emissions or negative emissions of greenhouse gases. Now, some may say that's impossible. How can you do this? Yes, you can do it, because there are means, firstly, by which you reduce emissions themselves, and secondly, you could possibly, through cutting down deforestation, eliminating deforestation, expanding forestry, and possibly coming up with carbon capture and storage technologies, be able to ensure that the net emissions that you get go down to zero or negative levels. This is another depiction which really gives you the emissions stabilization of atmospheric concentrations moving away from the baseline. And what you would see over here is that if we want to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius, then we would have to ensure concentration of CO2 equivalent of all the greenhouse gases around where we are today, 430 to 480 parts per million. What would this take? Well, here, this is a bit of a complicated diagram, but I think if you were to spend 2 minutes on it, it will come out very clearly. What we have on the left-hand side is a depiction of the reasons for concern or the level of risk that we associate, for instance, to in respect of threatened ecosystems. And the second one is basically extreme events, and so on. And how do these risks or these reasons for concern relate to cumulative CO2 emission levels? And that's shown in the second graph on the right-hand side. And below that is what you get in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, because each of the scenarios is based on all the greenhouse gases that are going to increase in the future, how much of it is carbon dioxide, how much of it is all the other greenhouse gases put together. So this gives you a relationship. And I think if one reflects on this diagram, one would say, okay, we really cannot deal with a level of concern above what, let's say, draw a line somewhere or the other. And if we decide on that, then what is it that CO2 emissions should peak at globally? And what does that imply in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? So this, again, is what I would call a synthesis diagram that tells you how to go about it. Now, what would it take to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius? Fortunately, measures exist to achieve the substantial emissions reduction required to limit likely warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And there's no getting away from the fact that we need a combination of adaptation as well as mitigation measures. Because there is a certain inertia in the system. Impacts of climate change will continue for several decades. And therefore, we have no choice but to be able to adapt to them. Whether it is increase in temperature, changes in precipitation patterns, impacts on agriculture, impacts on human health, which are also serious. We'll have to put in place measures. And I'll just take a minute to tell you about something that happened in real life. In the year 2003, while there was this terrible heat wave in Europe, in a part of southern India also there was a heat wave, and almost 4,000 people died according to records. The number may have been even higher. So I was asked to chair a committee by the Chief Minister of the state to look into what happened and what can be done to prevent it. What was appalling is the fact that everybody in the villages there had television, had radios, but we didn't use this medium to, warn people about what was happening. So early warning systems are clearly the lowest hanging fruit that you can get as far as adaptation is concerned. And we've seen signs of that recently. A few months ago, there was a terrible cyclone in the eastern part of India. And this time around, the government was prepared, took the early warning seriously, and lives and property were protected as a result. So we need adaptation, but however, beyond a certain stage, to adapt will become extremely difficult, and therefore we have to ensure that temperature increase and climate change are limited to a level that global society has to decide as being the ultimate. Because beyond that, adaptation may not work. The other important thing that I want to mention is that reductions in greenhouse gas emissions certainly poses technological, economic, social, and institutional challenges. It's not going to be easy. But delaying mitigation will substantially increase the challenges associated with limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius. Why? Because let's say we delay action for the next few decades. Then we'll have to bring down emissions even more sharply. And for that, you would need technologies. You would need means that would bring about a very rapid reduction. And those technologies may not even be developed in the short period of time available to us. So if one looks at the future, and one looks at the pathway by which we stabilize the concentration of greenhouse gases to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius or below, then the sooner we start, the better, and the more we do earlier, the better. That's a very, very clear lesson that we've got from this. What are the mitigation measures? And all of these subscribe to the objectives of green growth. More efficient use of energy, greater use of low carbon and no carbon energy. In fact, we have said that by 2050, we would have to treble or quadruple low carbon or zero carbon sources of energy supply. So that's the challenge that we have for the next 35 odd years. Improved carbon sinks, so that means reducing deforestation, improving forest management, expanding forest cover, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, because that also is an important option, and last but certainly not least, lifestyle and behavioral changes. I mean, that's something that human society has to start reflecting on in terms of the choices we make as individuals and how, in the aggregate, all of this is going to become important. Now, ambitious mitigation is affordable, because if we take our RCP 2.6 scenario, which is the most ambitious mitigation scenario, then economic growth will be reduced by 0.06% per annum. And this is against an assumed growth rate of business as usual of 1.6 to 3%. So you can see it's a very small fraction in terms of foregoing what you call the benefits of growth. And this translates into delayed but not foregone growth. And the estimated cost, of course, does not account for the benefits of reduced climate change. If you take those into account, then you're probably going to encounter negative costs. And unmitigated climate change would create increasing risks to economic growth. This, I think, is important because whatever the form of growth, green or otherwise, climate change would make it very difficult to achieve any kind of growth. What are the core benefits? Improved energy efficiency and therefore energy security. Cleaner energy sources, air quality and human health will improve. Reduced energy and water consumption in urban areas, sustainable agriculture and forestry, protection of ecosystems of carbon storage. All of these are the foundations on which green growth rests. So, here you see a major correspondence between actions to deal with climate change and what would put us on the path of what you might call green growth. A stable climate is an important component of sustainable development, and designing an effective climate policy involves mainstreaming climate in the design of sustainable development strategies. Behavior, lifestyle, and culture can substantially contribute to lowering emissions. Certainly, changes in consumption patterns, dietary changes, reduction in food waste, and there are many others that one could think of. Now, as far as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is concerned, which our distinguished host was responsible for several years in getting the world to act on this, the key provision over here is to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And such a level should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change and to ensure that food production is not threatened and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. So this is the core of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, science cannot tell us what is dangerous and what is not, because that involves governance issues, ethical dimensions, equity, value judgments, economic assessment. But I think science can certainly assist in coming up with means by which global society can decide enough is enough. We can't go beyond this. And this is what the synthesis report and the fifth assessment report, I hope, will help to determine. And some scientific facts which I hope will help the global community to decide what would be dangerous. We would have more intense and more frequent extreme precipitation events over many regions. Likely that the Arctic Ocean will become nearly ice-free in September, as I mentioned before, mid-century. Very likely that global sea level rise will continue in the 21st century. And here I want to mention an important fact. Even with the RCP 2.6 scenario, that means the scenario that will give us a high assurance of 2 degrees or less increase in temperature, sea level rise will be anywhere from 0.26 to 0.55 meters. So that's not utopia, it's not heaven. It's still going to be a very, very difficult situation. And the world has to decide, are we going to stabilize at 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees? That's something that needs to be done. Projections of increasing displacement of people and risks. Groundwater resources in some regions and renewable surface water water resources will also be affected. Then projections of increasing displacement of people and risks of violent conflict. And there's going to be risk associated with crossing certain thresholds. These will increase with rising temperatures. So I think all of these facts should help us determine whether we are actually going to move towards stabilization of the Earth's climate. Now, to stabilize at 2 degrees Celsius, we had a total carbon budget of 2,900 gigatons of CO2. We've used up 1,900. We have just about 1,000 gigatons of CO2 left as part of our budget. So we need to move rather quickly in reducing emissions so that this budget does not get burst in any way. And I'll just take a minute. I know my time is up, but I'll just take one more minute. We have two choices over here. On the left-hand side, you have a world with substantial mitigation. On the right-hand side, without additional mitigation. And the shading gives you the increase in temperature. And you would find that the Arctic is going to warm far more than the rest of the globe. So basically, we have to decide what kind of world we want. Do we want a world in which the climate is going to be reasonably acceptable in terms of the changes that are going to take place, and whether ecosystems and everything that climate impacts on will be stable or otherwise? And here I would say that a bioeconomic future is something that the world needs to consider, because it gives you opportunities not only to stabilize the climate, but also move towards a pattern of green growth. So this is essentially what I had to say. I believe that if one is looking at options for promoting and adopting green models of growth, then looking at every aspect of climate change and what's needed to deal with this growing challenge is going to be an important central part of any such initiative. I'll just end by quoting an anecdote. Mahatma Gandhi was once asked, would you not want India to become as prosperous as Britain? And he said it took Britain to use half the resources of this planet to reach its level of prosperity. How many planets would a country like India require? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pachauri. My past and present partner in crime in trying to get climate change understanding up the international agenda. Don't worry, I'm not going to speak for very long. Your job is to summarize and synthesize and bring the message home. Thank you for a fascinating presentation, which I would like to summarize in one sentence. And that sentence is, failure to address climate change will knock out the ability of communities to grow in any way whatsoever. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director General. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to stand between you and dinner. My job right now is to officially close the official part of our program. In closing on my part, I just want to say that I'm not an expert, and I've been sitting on the sidelines watching your discussions, and the dedication and the passion that you have shown me was very inspiring. And to borrow Ms. Robinson's words this morning, I think maybe perhaps all of you are here today because you are prisoners of hope. And so thank you for allowing me to be part of your program. Well, with that said, I would now like to close the official part of our program, and we are going to serve dinner. I know that today's discussions gave you plenty of food for thought, but now it is time to enjoy food for our bodies and enjoy the company of wonderful friends. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your active participation. It has been a great pleasure. Thank you.